Good evening. My name is Matthew Sackle, and I'm the Associate Manager of Education at the Illinois Holocaust Museum. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, board, and staff, I welcome you to this evening's program, Out of the Shadows, Into the Streets, LGBTQ+ Representation in the Media. Before introducing our moderator, Eric Marcus, I wanted to share a brief story. Going to the bookstore was a big deal, but I didn't drive. My mom would take me to Borders Books and Music in Rochester, New York, and drop me off at the door while she looked for parking. This would give me approximately 6 minutes to buy my copy of The Advocate, Out magazine, and grab a title from the LGBTQ section, and then meet my mom at the door. FYI, she knew exactly what she was doing, and to this day I'm thankful for it. On one of those adventures, my senior year of high school, I selected The Male Couple's Guide to Living Together as my title. Seemed like a proper title for me. I could study up on something I just knew I wanted to happen in my own life. It wasn't until about 6 weeks ago, when looking at Instagram, I realized the author was Eric Marcus. Eric Marcus is the founder and host of the award-winning Making Gay History podcast, which mines his decades-old audio archive of rare interviews conducted for his oral history book of the same name about the LGBTQ civil rights movement, to create intimate, personal portraits of both known and long-forgotten champions, heroes, and witnesses to history. His other books include Is It a Choice? Why Suicide? And Breaking the Surface, the #1 New York Times bestselling autobiography of Olympic diving champion Greg Louganis. Eric is also the co-producer of Those Who Were There, a podcast drawn from the Yale University's Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust testimonies. And he is the founder and chair of the Stonewall 50 Consortium, an organization that brings together 240 not-for-profit institutions and organizations committed to producing programming, exhibitions, and educational materials related to the LGBTQ history and culture. I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Matthew. One of the things I've loved about being an author is that you never know where your books will wind up. A quick story. I was at a benefit in Fort Lauderdale for the Stonewall Museum, the Stonewall National Museum and Archives. And one of the ushers spotted me and said, "Are you Eric Marcus?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, 30 some odd years ago, my boyfriend and I went camping and took the Male Couple's Guide with us on the trip, and we each underlined or highlighted the things that were important to us and then compared them." And he said, "I think that's the reason our relationship has been so successful." And I said to him, I probably should have read the book, because the relationship that book is based on didn't last. So, next time I'll read my own book. So thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Illinois Holocaust Museum. I'm just thrilled to be here with these special guests on our panel tonight, who I will introduce. Katie Barnes is an award-winning, Katie, you can raise, award-winning feature writer at ESPN, focusing on storytelling at the intersection of sports and gender. Katie's writing on young transgender athletes has earned 2 GLAAD Award nominations, and Katie is hard at work on a forthcoming book from St. Martin's Press on a similar topic. Congratulations, that's a big deal.
Thank you.
Katie was named the Nlgja Journalist of the Year in 2017. And Nlgja used to be called the National Lesbian Gay Journalists Association, but it's called something else.
It's like the it's Nlgja the Association of LGBTQ Journalists.
Yes.
The official
Yeah.
title.
Well, I've taken to using the old names for all the organizations because I know them.
Yeah.
Kate Sosman is the LGBTQ+ reporter at the 19th, a nonprofit newsroom covering the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. Kate's focus is on transgender rights, incarceration, politics, and public policy. Kate has conducted deep dive investigations into transgender prison abuse and homicides for NBC News. They previously worked at Logo TV, Into, and the Windy City Times. Kate lives in Los Angeles. Better weather there. Yes. Tracy Baim, who I've known for a very long time. and admired, is the publisher of the Chicago Reader newspaper. She is co-founder, past publisher, and managing editor of the Windy City Times, Chicago's oldest and only LGBTQ newspaper. Tracy received the 2013, and this is an abbreviated bio, by the way, and I apologize for leaving a few things out. Tracy received the 2013 Chicago Headline Club Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2014, she was inducted into the National LGBT Journalists Association Hall of Fame. In 2018, she was inducted alongside her late mother, Joy Darrow, into the Association of Women Journalists Chicago Inaugural Women's Journalism Hall of Fame. Tracy is the author of several books, most recently a biography of Barbara Giddings, one of the pioneers of our movement. Tracy also executive produced 2 films, Hannah Free and Scrooge and Marley, an LGBT Christmas tale. Welcome to our panelists. So I've already apologized to you in advance that I'm going to interrupt, so they know that it's going to happen because we have a bit of ground to cover this evening, but we have time. We'll leave time at the end for questions, so think about your questions, and I'll let you know a little bit in advance when we're ready for them. So my first question is, what's your first memory of seeing anything related, good or bad, in the media, television, print, wherever, about LGBTQ people? First memory. While you're thinking, I'll tell you my first memory.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
It was a show called Medical Center, starring Chad Everett. It is? Was it the episode where the doctor says he's a homosexual? Why don't you tell? I can't believe we share that.
That was one of the ones I was thinking of.
Is your mic?
1970.
Is your mic on?
It doesn't sound like it.
It's on. It was the 1970s, right? Late 1970s, early 1970s?
It was about 1975, 74.
Yeah, I remember seeing that live, and also a movie called In the Glitter Palace, a lesbian movie with Barbara Hershey.
So first, I guess my mic is on, so I shouldn't be here. Can you hear me from here? Yeah, okay. So first, describe the medical center episode where you saw that, because I remember vividly.
Oh, I only remember that there was a gay theme to the story.
So the theme was that there was another doctor who it turned out was gay, and he said, I'm the kind you can't tell, and I'm going to get treatment. I was probably 14 or 15. My sister was in love with Chad Everett. He wasn't my type. And I didn't say anything to my sister, but I was horrified. So that was the medical center. And what was the other one?
In the Glitter Palace with Barbara Hershey. It was a lesbian movie. I can't remember the name of the woman that starred opposite her. Well, both of them were pretty well known for the set 1970s. But other than that, it was TV shows like, with Christy McNichol, and ones where you just kind of knew, and so you just kind of intuited a lesbian life.
But the movie that you mentioned, how did it portray lesbians?
It was traumatic, drama. It was all drama and death,
Oh.
Most shows were, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, in those days, I don't know if you're familiar with the 1960s movies. It was Victim and, I forgot the other one.
Killing a Sister George.
No, and the gay people always wound up dead at the end. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Boys
Yeah.
in the
Yeah, we grew up in
I mean, in fairness, for much of television representation of queer women, not much has changed. So
what was your first memory?
my first memory, I might have earlier memories, but specifically of media, was this ABC show, Brothers and Sisters. Okay, yeah, the brother, whatever his name is. And he was gay, and there was a whole coming out episode, and he kissed a guy, and then eventually he got married, and it was a whole thing. That's what I remember. I'd had other interactions with my family around a language when it came to being gay or saying the word queer of some kind. But in media, that's the first thing I can remember.
So that was a positive representation.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
It wasn't bad. It probably hasn't aged well, but at that time it was fairly progressive.
Okay, so we'll circle back to positive representations. Kate, what about for you?
So mine is not necessarily about being gay. I think it's a kind of a trans or a gender, it's a complicated. I don't think it was intentionally, it was not meant to be like a queer story, but I grew up watching Mary Martin's Peter Pan. And so Mary Martin was portraying Peter Pan, and that just blew my mind, right? Like that to me was like opened up a world of possibility, and I just like started to dress as Peter Pan. And like for me, that was like, okay, now I know what's possible. Like here is a woman who becomes a boy. Like that is just fantastic. And that's all I wanted to do. And I just like performed that over and over and over again.
Kate, I'm so clueless that it never occurred to me there was anything, even until you just brought it up. Of course, Mary Martin played Peter Pan, but Peter Pan was a boy, and she was playing a boy. And no one commented on that at the time, did they?
You know, I don't know if it was ever a controversy, but like now that I've gotten older, I've like mentioned it to people, and lots of like queer trans mask friends of mine will be like, "Oh yeah," and then like lots of friends of mine who like date or into queer trans mask people will be like, "Oh yeah, thirsted for that." Like, so I think it was a thing among queer people growing up.
That is, yeah, I just didn't, I noticed all kinds of things, but I didn't notice that. So, back to you.
Okay.
So,
I'm fixing my mic here.
we're going to focus on
Does that work?
that. Yes,
Okay.
that does work.
Mike was hiding.
So, what was your first memory of seeing something positive, LGBTQ related, not medical center, not lesbians in prisons,
And not like that I had to read into it.
right? And this could be television,
Yeah,
print.
to me, there were there were a lot of magazines around, and so I know that I would have read stuff as things like in the late '70s. There started to be more coverage in like Time magazine and some other places. But my conscious memory is TV. I had just sat in front of the TV every night doing my homework, and
You sat
Billy
in front
Chris-
of the TV doing your homework.
yeah,
I mean,
that's
same.
all I
so.
did is that I can't work without noise now because that's all I
Tracy,
do.
we're the same person. That's incredible.
I'm your mother.
We
Probably.
were
Age-wise, I'm thinking. Yeah, so I think Billy Crystal in Soap, I don't even know when that ran, but to me, if I'm here being told to do something about that past, and it comes to mind because, it also didn't age well. But at the time, it was like, oh, gay people can be funny and laughed at,
Yeah.
but be part of the joke, be in on the joke. And, that to me was a very forward show for its era.
For me, it was a print article in the New York Times. The New York Times used to have a style page, sort of the women's page. And I called it, later it became the homosexual page, like the style section, which is very gay, LGBTQ now. But in 1984, 85, they did an article with a headline, "Homosexual Couples Find a Quiet Pride." And there was a picture of Damian Martin and Emery Hetrick, who founded the first organization for the protection of lesbian and gay youth in New York. And Damian Martin, who's a psychiatrist, was sitting in his leather high-back chair in a suit, and Damian was in a sweater vest and tie, standing next to him with his arm on the chair. And it was so benign, but the New York Times had never, ever published anything like that. I was much more, the other article I remember was the 1981 headline when the first article about became AIDS was published. Its headline was, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." So that was so shocking. I clipped the article, I still have it in my file, because it was so rare. So I wonder, as I turn the page, growing up, Katie, where did you get your gay news from? And I'm going to be using gay interchangeably with LGBTQ occasionally because I tend to stumble. So I don't mean offense by that. But where did you first get your gay news?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say probably Autostraddle, actually.
What is it?
Autostraddle?
Auto.
Oh, this is really funny. Okay. So Autostraddle.
Is this an age thing?
Yes. and probably a gender thing too, I would imagine. So Autostraddle is an LGBTQ women-focused blog that started in 2009. And so I came out in like 2007. And Autostraddle originated as, really from Reese, who's the former editor-in-chief, but founder of the site, writing L-word recaps. And so then it grew into this big blog, and to this day, it's one of mostly reader-supported, and is one of our few remaining existing independent LGBTQ media websites. And there's a lot of content on it, but there's also a ton of news. And so I think for me, as a young person, that was where I got most of it.
How did you find it?
I could not tell you.
Uh-huh.
I honestly don't know. I found it one day, and it was like my favorite thing, and I read it every day for most of my late high school and college years.
Wow. Why was it a favorite?
I think because there was so much stuff, and it was the first time that I really felt like I found anything that represented any part of how I showed up in the world and spoke to me and my sensibilities. And then also, as I explored my own gender identity, I found that there was such a range of perspectives represented in the content on that site that I was able to also grow with it. And so, like, at one point, there was this essay series that was specifically focused on butch identity. And I'd never seen something like that before. And for me, at that point in time, I found that to be very essential. But, like, I also will search the Autostraddle tags for homeowner tips that are just, like, specifically gay. I don't know why, but it's like there's everything there for me. And so that's where I really, I think, found news in that regard.
I apologize for my cluelessness.
No, it's okay.
But when I first saw the write-up on this program, it made reference to the last 20 years. And I thought, I know nothing about the last 20 years. I know about from 30 years ago prior. So I've been trying to read up, but I'd never heard of this.
Intergenerational sharing.
It is a wonderful thing.
It is.
It is. Kate, where did you get your LGBTQ news?
So this is really sort of odd and interesting. I don't think I did. Like, until I started working actually for Windy City Times or Tracy, I didn't know to seek it out. I graduated from undergrad in 2008, and I bounced around, tried really hard to get a job in journalism, and I graduated into a recession. It was a difficult time, and I freelanced, and no one would hire me. I was a trans masculine gender nonconforming person, and the last place that I sort of thought to look at that point was the LGBTQ newspaper, and Tracy gave me a job, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll get to mainstream media someday, right? And I didn't understand at the time that I was stepping into something deeply meaningful that would change my life, and that being a trans person reporting on trans people would be meaningful for other people who would read that. Nor did I understand that I was not totally comfortable with the fact that I was a trans person and that I needed that community and that I needed to step into that space. And so I didn't see myself as like occupying that, really, I don't think fully. And so actually reporting on the community that I was part of really changed things for me. And I learned to find the news via Windy City Times. Really, it changed who I was. So
I have some follow-up questions for you that we're going to get to a little farther on about the challenges that LGBTQ people have faced in finding work, journalists, people like us. Tracy, when you were starting in journalism, in fact, that is my next question. No, actually, I didn't ask you where you got your gay news from. Before the Windy City Times.
I didn't really in high school, and then I went away to Des Moines, Iowa, for college.
A center of gay life.
Center of gay life. There was OP's gay bar. I got my news verbally, and then I created a feminist 2-page newsletter in college that had lesbian stuff in it. So I created it. I didn't know where it was, and I thought my career aspirations were Ms. Magazine after college, and that didn't happen. So, I didn't even, I was aware I was gay, but in Des Moines, Iowa, and with no internet, I was writing it. I was making it up.
Yeah.
as I went.
Which is what you've done for your whole career.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then let me ask you that next question. Why did you start the Windy City Times? Couldn't you get gay news in the Chicago Tribune?
So I graduated in May of 1984, and I thought I was going to be a typesetter the rest of my life because my journalism professor said, "You're not going to work in journalism."
They said that to me
Nicely,
too.
yeah. Paternalistically, I'd say.
Why do you think you said that?
Oh, they knew better. Because there was Randy Schultz and who else, right? Working as openly gay journalists in the early 1980s in the United States. There were like 5.
Well, and Randy didn't get, we're just working on it. I interviewed Randy 30 some odd years ago, and we're just working on editing a piece for our next season of the podcast. He couldn't get a job anywhere at any of the major newspapers. He finally got a job with The Advocate. That was his.
Yeah, by the time I graduated in 84, 85, he was
out
already,
yeah.
and in like a San Francisco Chronicle or something.
Right.
So that was it. So it was true. So my stepfather worked at the Chicago Tribune. My mother worked at the Chicago Defender. They both told me the same thing. My stepfather knew closeted gay people working at the Tribune, and they were terrified. The Tribune was still equating us to pedophiles, and making it either scandal or stereotype. And certainly on AIDS and HIV, there were 4 Tribune reporters who died of HIV. They didn't acknowledge it in the obituaries. So that was the environment. And so in 1984, my mother had heard of a job at Gay Life newspaper. And when I walked in, I saw the typesetting machine, and I was like, I can run that. So I wormed my way in, and
for people,
a big old refrigerator-sized typesetting machine that worked on photochemicals.
A little word for the younger people.
Yeah,
here.
yeah. It was basically right prior to computers. There were equipment that was literally the size of a refrigerator. What's interesting is the speed of change was crazy because in high school I learned how to use the hot lead, old style typesetting machines that were around for 400 years.
And what is hot lead?
Hot lead. It burned you when it dropped the chunk of lead into the back, and you would create type out of lines of lead. That's why you call it leading.
So this is for our younger panel members. So
excuse me, I have seen this in movies.
I saw Newsies, okay? I saw Newsies.
So, I love journalism movies. I see them drop the lead in.
So when I was in elementary school, we went on a trip to the New York Daily News, and they had these huge machines in the basement, and people would sit at these it was all men, sat at these huge machines with big typewriters. They were essentially typewriters.
Yeah.
Is that what?
Well, differently organized, which is why I can't type to this day. I type with 2 fingers, hunt and peck, because there was a different keyboard. But it literally was lead. That's why we call it leading between the lines, because it was a line of lead type. But anyway, I also learned how to use the computers as they came into Lane Tech High School. I learned that too. So Gay Life had one of those machines, Mergenthaler, I think. And so I walked in and said, I can run that. And I can also write, and I can take photos. I'll lay out, I'll deliver the paper. You just tell me what I can do. So I did all of those things in the first year, and I became managing editor. And then, but Chuck Renslow, who the owner of it, who I still liked, and I actually wrote a book about later on, he had a reputation of bias, and not that he ran everything. He ran a bathhouse, he ran International Mr. Leather, he owned bars, and so there was this assumption that he was running. He was too powerful. There's people in this room that know and are friends with Chuck too. I didn't agree with that, but I was 22 years old, and a group of people from Windy City Gay Life were leaving to start Windy City Times, and I was convinced to go with them and be the co-founder, be the first managing editor of Windy City Times. So that, I kind of stumbled into the things, but it was, I'm grateful every day that I didn't try a mainstream path. I think I would have left in 4 years, max. Most of my friends who graduated college in that era of journalism left. It was just not, it's not pretty now. It was not pretty then, especially if you were different, female, people of color. If you were anything that wasn't a cisgender white man from a certain class, it just wasn't
Cisgender
fun.
White straight.
Straight.
Yeah.
Or closeted.
This is the same thing for me. I found myself being the only or the first, and really wasn't interested in being a pioneer. But then also being told in 1988 at CBS News that they would never put an openly gay person on camera.
Right. So luckily I found a different path.
Yeah. So I have some career questions. And then when it comes career, not queer, career questions.
Career.
And then we'll come back to representation in media, where we need to go with it. But I'm also intensely curious about your careers, what you do. So Katie, How did you wind up writing for ESPN? And then I have a follow-up question for that.
Yeah, decidedly mainstream. So it was an accident, truly. I started writing, very gay. I started writing fan fiction when I was like 16 years old. And so I just wrote a lot. But it was never really something that I thought I wanted to pursue as a career.
What was your college major?
I majored in history, Russian studies, and American studies, and I have a minor in women and gender studies. I have a master's degree in higher education. So also not journalism. I did not do any kind of journalism while I was in school. Never wrote for my paper, never did any of that. And I was trying to figure out my life at the end of my graduate school program. I had started blogging at feministing.com, doing a sports and pop culture column there every week. And then I was like, I'm going to figure out my life. And I went on a 50-state LGBT food tour. And
Wait, no.
I know.
That's a. Should I save the question? That's actually a good question.
What is it? Okay, so this is what happened. So I met up with these people who had this idea that they were going to connect local restaurants with LGBT centers in the city through a BLGT sandwich. So they were BLTs, and the G was the special ingredient from the chef. So like guanciale, or garlic aioli, green onion, whatever. I had so many BLTs. And so we like went across the country doing that. I did 30 states in 2 months. It was a lot. And in the middle of that, I applied cold for a job at ESPN as a digital media associate, which is essentially an intern. And they took me. And I haven't left.
Huh?
It's wild.
And what kind of reception did you get?
Well, it's interesting. I was one of 12 finalists for the position that I ended up getting. The only one that came through HR. Everyone else had internal referrals. So use your internal referrals was what I had friends at ESPN. I could not believe. People should never do what I did.
But you didn't. You went in through HR, which is usually the dead end.
Correct.
Yes,
yeah. That is absolutely true. And so I interviewed. I was out in my whole interview as both queer and non-binary. My pronouns were very clearly stated. And I don't know, they liked it, I guess. It's wild. I have no clue. I basically was just like, you don't have anybody like me, so you should fix it.
Did you say that?
Yeah, 100% to their face. They were like, why should we hire you? I'm like, this is why.
So Tracy, I don't know why you didn't try that when you were just out of school.
Oh my God.
I don't know, maybe 2015 was a little different than 1984, but
it's just
that was an ominous year to graduate. The book based on 1980.
When I was interviewing some of the older activists, people in their 60s and 70s, they talked about the pace at which things had changed for them. This is 30 years ago, and that they couldn't quite believe the pace of change. And Tracy, I think you and I are now, we've reached the stage where the pace of change is so unbelievable that to talk with people, young people who came into the world in a very different place is breathtaking.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been reckless, but it worked out. So
No, it clearly was not reckless at all.
Yeah.
Have you ever had any pushback about what you wanted to write about?
No. Anytime I have ever, have I pitched stories that have not been greenlit? Yes. Have they ever not been greenlit because they are focused on queer and or trans people? No. There was I'm like the first trans person or non-binary person that many of my colleagues have worked with. And so that was a bit of a learning curve, around pronouns. It took maybe 2 years. But on my immediate team, I'm never misgendered. And I write almost exclusively in women's sports, and I write mostly about policy and issues affecting particularly trans people in sports. And they always say yes.
That's great.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Kate, what was the environment like? Well, you said when you were starting out in your career, you tried mainstream journalism and got no's. Do you think it had a lot to do with who you are?
I think it had some, partially.
Let me rephrase that. Do you think it had anything to do with who you are?
I think it had some to do with who I am. I think I also graduated into a recession, into a time that was so difficult for journalism. print was dying and was going through a crisis. And I had very minimal experience in journalism, and it was just a really hard time. So it was a combination of factors, truly. I did have clips. I had done international reporting in undergrad professionally, and so I felt like I had something, but it wasn't everything, and it was such a tough time to graduate. But yeah, it was really hard to, continue to apply and to get in front of people and then feel like I'm really visibly queer and to feel like I was hitting dead ends. So
What did that do to your spirit?
the first few years of college were just so tough. They were so tough. And I was like, but I don't know, I never felt like a question about whether or not I wanted to be a reporter, really. I just felt like that was where it was going to go. So.
Were you clear early on about the things you wanted to report on?
No, not at all. I just felt like I wanted to. I felt like journalism was like the last ditch effort that we all had, like when everything else failed, right? Like the government fails you, the legal system fails you, like, and then like, you can go to the media, and if the media is working fairly decently, and this act of just, telling your story is powerful. Like people, just letting a lot of people know has the effect of changing things. And that to me was so appealing, to like be part of that process and not to feel like I was like owning it, but participating in it with communities. Like I just really liked that. I felt like that was really good work to do. And that if I could do that, that felt like a really good thing. And so I just wanted to do that. I didn't know what that beat would be or that I would ever develop a beat. And so finding queer media like really felt meaningful.
Do you recall what some of your early articles were for Tracy?
My first article for Tracy, funny, I remember it so specifically, was covering Veterans Day. Yeah.
What aspect of Veterans Day?
There was like a queer veterans like event, I think. Yeah, and I just remember going, and I was supposed to take pictures for the event, and I had this like tiny like point and shoot digital camera, which I couldn't quite get to work. And I just remember coming back, and I think at some point after like a few events, I'm not sure if it was Tracy or her dad Hal who said to me like, you should really get a camera because you're so bad at taking photos that you need all the help you can get. And so I did. I invested in a really good camera, and now I take like pretty good, serious photos. But it was really atrocious. I was just like, everything was a blur. I was like, here you go. Like,
Just a quick question, an aside. What exactly is the 19th? Can you describe for people here who don't know the 19th what it is?
Yes.
Although I now know what it is because you interviewed me.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite topics. So the 19th is a nonprofit newsroom that covers the intersection of gender, politics, and public policy. And basically what that means is if you've ever read like a ProPublica, we produce articles basically that are free to republish. And so we get money from everywhere, meaning people donate it to us. We get it from grants, or sometimes big companies give it to us, or donors. And then our journalism is free for anyone to republish. So we have a news partnership with USA Today, PBS, NBC, lots of different places republish it. And we cover basically gender and politics. And so we have like a reporter who covers things about disability, caregiving. We have a reporter who covers healthcare. I do LGBTQ plus issues. And basically we focus a lot on race. We focus on underrepresented communities. And our goal is really to get to the heart of communities who are not covered.
And it's sort of like an Associated Press, an LGBTQ Associated Press for free.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are all over the place. So the one thing I like about the 19th is, like as a trans reporter, we can have a conversation and make a decision about, hey, we want to start framing things in this way, or we're going to make a style decision as a newsroom to do this. We think this is appropriate. And then that will hit USA Today and it's 300 newspapers. Right. And that'll usually get on to PBS and Miss Magazine and whoever else picks us up on that article. And it's a huge impact.
That's extraordinary. And it's really under the radar for the most part.
I don't know.
Under my radar, what do I know?
Yeah, I mean, our editor at large is a regular on MSNBC. It's
I don't
almost
watch
like
MSNBC.
we launched a year and a half ago. We're still new, so yeah.
Yes. What is the 19th reference?
It is a reference to the 19th Amendment, and they put an asterisk on it to acknowledge the unfinished work of the 19th, because of course, Black women did not get the right to vote, and trans people still disenfranchised. Lots of Black voters are still disenfranchised, as well as other communities.
So, Tracy, you have a long view, as do I. And I wonder, how have you seen the portrayal of LGBTQ people in mainstream media evolve over the course of your career?
You know, the perspective of not just the past 37 or so years that I've done it, but also been lucky enough to look back even further in some of the works I did, and I brought a couple of the books if folks want to go back and look through past, way back further into gay media history. But the changes are really phenomenal, right? Like the reason, thank you, Eric.
Show and tell is very important when you're an author.
And before I forget, I want to say I'm co-publisher of the Chicago Reader, and the other co-publisher, another queer woman, is here tonight, Karen Hawkins. And it's a very queer-friendly and inclusive staff now, somehow. I don't know. Now that Karen and I are there, it just changed a little bit. So the change is profound, right? The difference from 1984 to now in how the mainstream media looks at us, covers us, hires us, is run by us, et cetera, is so different. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, historically, is our community benefited from all the prior civil rights movements of this country. So the success we've had in the courts, which we hope we keep, are based on prior precedents of Loving v. Virginia on marriage equality and Roe v. Wade on the right to privacy. So we have prior movements for civil rights and immigration rights and every kind of movement that fed into the legal and social acceptance of people over time. So that when people say, how did the gay movement do this in 50 years? Well, it wasn't 50 years. It was actually about 100 years, because in 1924, Henry Gerber started the first gay rights organization in the United States. I brought some of these flyers here, and Henry Gerber's on that one over there, almost 100 years ago. Of course, he was shut down by the cops, and it took another 20 years for more gay organizations to start coming up. So to me, that's the prior movements part. But around 1990, a man named Leroy Aarons wanted to change the mainstream media. And that's what you had to do.
Who was he?
He was a journalist himself. And
the Oakland Tribune.
The Oakland Tribune. Yeah. I would not have remembered that. Thank you. I'm not up on his history except for what he did with Nlgja. And so what was going on in the 1980s in the mainstream media was organizations like the New York Times were refusing to even use the language of our community. As you said, the 19th trickle-down effect to all these other outlets. Yeah, there was the Associated Press Style Guide, and there was the New York Times as the top of the food chain, that if they changed something, things trickled out.
It was 1987 when the New York Times finally used the word gay as opposed to homosexual.
Right, but they took them a little bit longer really to make it a style choice, I think. Yeah. So homosexual, Michelangelo Signorelli did a big cover story about the New York Times in The Advocate about all this change. So the mainstream media was a wall that was keeping our progress back because of the way they covered us, the way they wouldn't let us cover us in their pages and their news. So the national, when it was started, Nlgja, National Lesbian Gay Journalists Association, it had, to me, one of the most important impacts of a national organization in our entire movement's history. It's it's as important as Lambda Legal and NCLR and HRC and GLTF, and maybe in some ways even more important.
More important.
Yeah, and certainly underappreciated, because when it started around 1990, Karen's on the board, so correct me if I'm wrong, that it really, throughout the whole 90s, you can trace how the coverage of our community just shifted dramatically. Now, that paralleled the self-outing of our community, right? Like, because of HIV/AIDS and other things that were happening in the 80s, millions more people came out than were out there were maybe thousands in the 70s and hundreds in the 60s that would allow their face, their name to be used in the media, like under 200 prior to Stonewall. That's what Barbara Giddings and Frank Kameny say. So from 200 to millions by the 90s. So none of those, they all happened parallel, right? So it is unbelievable progress, but it's believable because of the things that kind of moved it forward like a tidal wave.
I remember that the first convention of the Nlgja, which I attended, and it was, if you can imagine, most of the journalists were still closeted who came to the convention, and there were hundreds. And I think most of us thought we were all alone in the world, and we didn't have people supporting us from behind in our wish to cover our community in ways that we thought should be covered. When I was at CBS Morning News, there was one morning meeting. I was the only out person on the editorial side in 1988. And my boss pitched a story on pederast priests. And she had been Geraldo Rivera's producer for his TV show. She liked those kinds of stories. And I was not very politically astute. I slapped the table because I lost my temper. And I said, if we're going to do one more story on pederast priests, we better do some positive stories on gay people, because you can't keep doing this. And after the meeting, one of my colleagues said, that was great. I'm really glad you spoke up. And I said, I wish you had spoken up too, but he was gay and closeted and fearful. This is before Nlgja. So I think what that organization did is it gave people who were in the profession the courage to step forward, knowing that there were lots of us who were there to support and protect. And
right,
fight.
they created guidelines, they created a style book, they lobbied externally and internally in organizations. The shift was really dramatic after Nlgja started.
Yeah. Did that have any impact on what you did at the Windy City Times?
It's very funny. In the early 90s, several papers, including the Tribune and Sometimes, started gay beats. Jean Letts-Griffin at the Tribune, and there was actually an openly lesbian reporter, Terry was her first name, in the late 80s at the Tribune. And then Tom Brune at the Sun-Times. And it was great seeing them out and covering events. And I thought, oh, well, the gay press, we won't be needed eventually. But what happened was that lasted just a few years, right? As soon as cuts started happening in the media, the gay beat's going down. But what I do think is it professionalized. People were more willing to work for gay media with using their own names. When I started at Gay Life newspaper, there was a cadre of people already there. And when they'd leave, this one guy, Paul Cotton, was the name I knew him by. And like a few months later, he says, oh, you might get a reference check for me. This is my real name. And I was just like, wait a minute, we don't use our real names here? I didn't know that.
I wish someone had sent you a memo.
Yeah, I'm glad. I would not have done that. But that's how it was, right? You wouldn't want that on your resume. And then, flash forward, and I think I took 29 seconds to decide to hire Kate. The quality of the journalism and the journalists coming into gay media shifted in the 90s and 2000s because it was no longer a career killer.
Right.
So it did have this trickle-down effect helping gay media by getting it even stronger. What's really funny is I still love Nlgja, but for at least its first 10 or 15 years, they wouldn't allow gay media to enter any of their competitions.
Really?
They kept us out. They didn't want us at their conferences. They didn't want us on their panels. They didn't want our media entering a competition for like best feature story or best sports story. They didn't want gay media entering.
Well, I'm just shocked.
I think it was both that they didn't see us as legitimate.
Right.
So a little bit of internal homophobia going on.
Yeah.
But also, we probably would have beat the pants off of most of those,
right.
and therefore they wanted to make a safe space for those mainstream places to do their work for the first, and then eventually they changed that. And when it was in Chicago, there was a whole gay media day track that I worked on, but it was frustrating for us because that would have been legitimizing for gay media. There were no gay media awards, and that we would have loved to have been in those.
Sure.
and let me just say, the one thing is then they eventually let us enter. We had to pay. The mainstream media, they not only did the work of entering them, they would like say, oh, we're going to submit this CBS story. They didn't charge them. And they charged the gay media. So, of course, I'm cheap and I did a few, but I wasn't going to do that many.
They charge everybody now. For what
they
it's
charge
worth.
everybody.
They need to because there's lots of changes.
I also like talking about Nlgja. I think it's important to point out this conversation we had at the beginning, which is you still don't know what Nlgja stands for, and it's because it continues to be Nlgja, which for a lot of trans people, bi people, queer people, continues to be a problem. And the Transgender Journalists Association launched within the last 2 years because of that. Like, trans people have not been able to find a space a lot of times within Nlgja.
Oh, yeah. And not only that, but I think it's fair to say that there are moments where Nlgja has perpetuated real harm when it comes to the trans community. And I say that as somebody who, I was just talking with Kate earlier, I was like, I love Nlgja convention. It's like one of my favorite things in the whole world. And also there is, it's emblematic of so many of our conversations around our historic organizations and how they have evolved or not evolved. And while there has been such tremendous good done, there's also been and continues to be harm perpetuated by those same organizations. And we as a community, I think, really struggle to put our arms around that.
Well, it's such a messy movement.
Yeah.
And always has been, and continues to, and it always will be. But it's also up to your generation to move things along.
Yeah, well.
And you are. So that brings me to my next question. Such a great segue. Thank you, Katie.
That's what I'm here for.
Tracy and I have seen the evolution over a long period of time. But even in the time that you've been involved, I imagine you've seen a change. I'll ask, have you seen a change in the portrayal of LGBTQ people in the media over the course of your career? And your career now goes back to, it's 10 years.
Oh, no.
No.
It's like 6.
6 years.
2015.
So, sorry. Over the 6 years, have you seen changes?
I know, I'm such a baby. Thanks for laughing, Tracy. It's fine.
That's a jealous laugh.
It is. This is the jealous corner here.
Yeah. The age way to go.
Yes.
That's all good. Well, I think yes and no. Like, of course, there are many, many examples of more positive representation in media and a more robust representation.
So, just some examples. What do you see?
Well, to go to a little throwback of my own, big Grey's Anatomy fan, Cali in Arizona forever. So, for me, that was a really big thing. Yeah, you can laugh at that.
Well,
That's real.
Likewise, right after I completely lost it.
Okay. Cali in Arizona, #Calzona, was like
Is this 29 seasons ago? How are you going to do this?
First of all, it was not 29 seasons ago. We're only on season 17. I have not watched since the season 9 finale. For the Calzona fans, you will know why. Yes. So I think, Cali in Arizona, was like the first lesbian relationship on primetime television for an extended period of time, ever, in terms of network representation, and Callie Torres being Latina and bisexual, there was some really great stuff in Grey's Anatomy. This is in the late aughts, early teens, it was pretty early, all things considered. So I think for me that was a mostly positive, the jumping the shark notwithstanding, piece of representation. But then I think about things like The 100. This is very young, where similar when we talk about the ways in which queer people get to have their moment of glory where they make out with someone and then somebody dies, right? And that was it happens all the time.
Still.
Yes.
Still?
I wrote about this in 2016 and it happened on The 100 with Lexa. I'm still mad about it. And so that's what I'm saying. I think there's a little bit of a push-pull. And for my for all the stuff that I'll say about my positive experience at ESPN, the way that I interviewed, how I've been hired, the success that I've had at the company, there has not been a queer reporter hired after me. And that's something that I think about a lot. Now, granted, we haven't hired many reporters, to be clear.
They have or haven't?
Have not. It's rough, right? It's media, so it's rough everywhere. But my group hasn't hired, which is the old magazine, has not hired a fully new person. We've had people come over from different groups. We haven't hired somebody new as a writer since my hire. But then also, like, we've seen Kate Fagan leave, we've seen Elsie Granderson leave, and so and Christina Carl, pioneering editor, also, yeah, Chicago person.
Chicago.
Shout out to Christina Carl and Chicago. Like, now has left ESPN and is the sports editor at San Francisco Chronicle. Great for her. Terrible for us. Like, they're just, it's like people have sort of departed the company, and I'm there, and I, love that experience, but we don't have enough. And that's something I think about a lot. Like, my success is personal. It's not necessarily, like, I can rationalize however I want to rationalize about the greater good, et cetera, et cetera. But, like, at the end of the day, just because I'm at ESPN doesn't mean that there are queer and trans journalists being hired for the types of positions that they want to be hired into. And so I'm constantly thinking about that and how that affects our own storytelling. I'm only one person. I can't cover every single transgender sports bill. And frankly, it's like I've done a number of those stories, and some fresh eyes would be great. Like, that's a real thing that I think about a lot. And so I think, progress is not linear, it's cyclical, and it's constant in that way.
Has what you write about changed over the last 6 years?
Well, no, I don't think. For me, I want to maintain my commitment to telling the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell when I first got into this business, and being committed to amplification around marginalized identities, and being committed to quality storytelling about our communities. I don't want to ever look back and say, oh yeah, I started my career telling queer and trans stories, but now I write about the NFL. Like, why? Like, I love the NFL. Like, I'm a sad Dolphins fan. It's fine. I know. But, ESPN has tons of NFL writers. They have tons of NBA writers. They don't need me. Like, we need me, and more of me, preferably. And so
I don't know. I want a Katie NFL show.
Listen, maybe someday. We could both and. But, like, I have a rule that I can't write about 3 cisgender men in a calendar year, no more than 3. And I have only written 2 stories in 6 years. So I'm very proud about that.
Wow.
Kate, how have you seen things evolve? And has what you write about changed?
Yeah. So I started reporting in 2006 when I was still an undergrad, and starting in queer media before marriage equality, things have changed dramatically in a few short years. So, I remember the early days of reporting at Windy City Times. The standard was still that in at least the stories that I did, and I don't know if this was a me thing or an us thing, but like I would still quote anti-LGBTQ activists in my reporting, like I don't know if that was a way to inform readers or in my mind to like be fair, but like at some point that stopped being acceptable, I think, to me and to us.
It was how it was done.
Yeah, right?
Forever.
A long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just did that. And
Yeah.
like at some point I was like, why am I putting hate groups in these stories? Like that's a really strange thing to do. Like I don't need to do that. And even now, like I work in mainstream media and like we have conversations about it all the time, which is like, do we have to do this? Like at what point is it necessary?
Yeah, the argument I finally made was if we are going to do that with gay people, we need to do that with racists and with people who are anti-Semitic, and we generally don't do that.
Right. Sometimes it's helpful in terms of like adding context for a reader, and if that's the case, then okay.
But not when it's gratuitous. Just
right.
To have it.
Just to like have the other side, right? Like this both sides journalism. That is, but and when I started reporting, that was the case, and the kinds of arguments that we weighed and subjected readers to have changed. I remember distinctly an argument about Michigan Women's Festival and whether or not trans people should be included, and like weighing that out at length in Windy City Times, and I'm sure Tracy remembers this, and we put in arguments for trans inclusion at Michigan Women's Festival. And if you don't know, Michigan Women's Festival is it's a women's festival that happens or that did happen. It's passed.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen anymore, and it excluded trans women, and is sort of the genesis for a lot of these arguments of women-born, women-only spaces. And I think today we probably wouldn't have even entertained that conversation, but at the time it really was like a topic, and now I think we would have been like, this strikes at the heart of humanity of our own community, and I don't know that we would have framed it that way, but yeah, I don't think we would have entertained it in the same way, and yeah, things have changed.
My sense is that it's just been maybe a half dozen years, and you'll correct me, in terms of the coverage of trans issues, trans and gender issues, that there's been an explosion of coverage.
Yeah, but the problem is it's not always good, and this recent BBC stuff is so
Oh my God.
atrocious.
What is, I'm sorry?
The last few days, the BBC has just run some horrible, horrible stuff that could have been written in 1950 about gay people. I mean, and it's getting, the problem these days is columns and essays and news articles. People don't know the difference, and it's I think irresponsible and malpractice to be allowing people to have this voice in a mainstream media. When a BBC or a Guardian puts it out, it legitimizes these horrible anti-trans views. So it's in some ways the gender is much more complex to get the mainstream media to do a better job on it.
My sense is that mainstream media is at the point in dealing with trans and gender issues that mainstream media was dealing with gay issues in the 80s. And that there was also, and I could be completely wrong, that there was a very organized anti-gay effort in the U.S. back in the 80s, in the way there is a very active anti-trans movement now.
I think the problem is the internet, right? So we didn't have the internet in the 1980s that had all these counter arguments and all these other ways that people could get their hate
Research.
out. Yeah. So it makes it harder to fight this.
I don't know if this is totally relevant, but one thing that I'm really interested in that we're sort of exploring in an upcoming piece at the 19th is the language around some of this, which is in parallel. Historically, arguments against gay people never employed the word gay, right? Like a lot of it was like homosexual, whatever,
homosexual deviants,
right?
Perverts, yeah.
A lot of the same thing is happening now, right? We don't talk about transgender people. We talk about men in little girls' bathrooms or biological males, or right. There's a lack of acknowledgement in all the talking points and the legislation, and a refusal to acknowledge the existence, humanity of trans people, right? And so I think that if you talk to most people one-on-one and you're do you support trans people? No one wants to be no, I'm a bigot. I want to, right? But if you're I want to keep men out of a little girl's restroom or a locker room, that's confusing. A lot of people are yeah, that sounds terrible. Why would I, right? And so that confusion of language, and so a lot of us don't know a trans person. We haven't sat down with the trans people, especially trans kids. And so if it's almost the same issue of coming out.
It's possible to demonize because people don't know people.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And there's also a very intentional obfuscation of language. So one of the things that, for my book, I spent 2 hours talking to Barbara Ehart, who is the author of HB 500 in Idaho, the first of the anti-trans athlete bills to pass, about everything. And she, one of the things that she said, was essentially that the choice of using the language of biological boys or biological males is very intentional and meant to conjure up specific images, right? And so part of, I think, one of the things that we are struggling with is just all of the nuance when we have these conversations about gender in particular, because we all have our own cultural assumptions about gender. And, we think that in the context of sports, for example, that like science is somewhere that it's not. And that's true for everyone on all sides of the issue. Like everyone wishes the science said more than it does. Um, but it says just enough that allows everyone to kind of put their own cultural assumptions onto the argument. And frankly, I think that most of mainstream journalism is just extremely lazy. And when it comes to that laziness, it has very dire consequences. And, I'm not trying to be like particularly rude about it, but I'm not convinced that many of the journalists who have covered, in particular, the sports bills have actually read the bills.
They don't know shit about
No,
this
they have
stuff.
no idea. Like,
Excuse my English.
they haven't read them, and I'm like, if you read them, like it says very clearly what they do. And so when it comes to the bare bones, like just basic coverage of, here's how many bills have been filed. This is what states that they've been filed in. Here's how many states have passed them. This is what they say. Like you can't really get that level of detail. Instead, what ends up happening is we have a litigation of language around, well, this is why the bill sponsor wants to do this. This is why advocates say that's bad. And maybe we hear from a trans person, but usually not.
Most journalists don't know a trans person because most people don't know a trans person, person to person. They don't have the time. I'm not excusing them because I got lots of calls during Stonewall 50 with reporters calling and saying, can you tell me something about Stonewall? Like, you want me to tell you, you want me to educate you about, how about, there are so many resources for that. Or they would make statements about Stonewall that were completely incorrect or drawn from old sources. There's an extraordinary amount of laziness. It may be in part because people don't have the time because people are so short-staffed, but it's just shocking.
Yeah, but the New York Times has the time.
They have the time and they have the staff.
Yeah, and so like I'm not talking, I mean, obviously there are deep, deep cuts within media and within journalism specifically, but there are also big papers that have the staff and have the resources and frankly are not committed to sure we can say fair coverage, but it's not even about fairness, it's about accuracy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it doesn't take that long to look up a legislative tracker and click a link and read a bill.
Yeah.
And so few journalists who are tasked with covering many of these topics are doing that. And it's creating, it's doing a real disservice, of course, to our community, but also to the industry writ large, and frankly, even to just how we have conversations about our democracy.
Yeah, no, it's shocking.
Yeah, not to be like, not to put too fine a point on it.
So where do you get your LGBTQ news now?
Now, everywhere.
Well,
specifically?
Yeah, specifically.
The 19th. Still autostraddle some days. I just like, everyone laughs at me. I do appreciate you all laughing at my jokes. Thank you. But I think, in some ways I think it's harder, but I try and read everything as much as I can. Like, I follow specific journalists on Twitter, and that helps a lot. Sort of, getting to different outlets that maybe I don't come across in my everyday. Like I'm going to read like Windy City Times right now, something like that. You know what I'm saying? So like in that sense, I try and take in a plethora, but specifically, I guess like all the typicals. I don't know.
So Kate, what are some of the typicals?
Yeah. So I read specific journalists also. I read Adam Rhodes.
Do you get any of the daily news feeds?
I do a lot of news via Twitter. I'll read them, which is an LGBTQ specific outlet. I get news from Into LGBTQ Nation, all the locals like
So
Windy
LGBTQ
City Times.
Nation Into Windy City Times.
Yeah, Philly Gay News. I also follow journalists. I follow Caitlin Burns. I follow Lucas Waldron. I follow Katie. I follow who else?
Who else? Oh my God, you're putting me on the spot like that.
Everyone. Yeah,
Everyone?
Travell Anderson.
Yes,
incredible journalist. I follow
Matthew.
Who is Matthew?
Matthew Rodriguez.
Matthew Rodriguez, a really great queer journalist and good
Would
friend.
you laugh?
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah, just a really good
I
friend.
just I suspect there's a story there.
Yeah, no,
you know.
just a good friend.
Okay.
Yeah, just there's a lot of great queer journalists that I follow and get news from via Twitter, and just have built sort of this constant churn of news.
There was
Google.
a time, and you mentioned how people were hired. Well, it was you, Tracy, who mentioned that people were hired. There were gay beats at the newspapers, then they disappeared. For a time, I depended upon the New York Times. If it was a big gay story, I knew it would be there. And now the New York Times doesn't even cover New York. For those of us who live in New York City, it makes us crazy that the New York Times doesn't cover New York except for an occasional article, a city of 8.5 million or 8.9 million. Where do you get your news, Tracy?
You know, even though I'm 58, I'm a Twitter holic. That's for darn sure.
Yes.
I kind of curate the journalists that were mentioned here. Certainly, Kate is my favorite national journalist. I'd give anything to have Kate back working for something I'm doing. But so, and I really love the work of some of the queer journalists at the Reader. Adam's doing fantastic stuff. Taryn's doing great stuff. Karen is, I'm a biggest fan. And so we have a lot of great journalists locally and at Windy City Times as well. But I really do curate. I almost feel like I'm making my own national queer media on Twitter. Like that by following these journalists and these publications, it's like creating this template of the top news of the day and queer lens on mainstream issues. That's what I really appreciate that we get now that we didn't get 30 years ago. We have people like Elsie Granderson just talking about sports, and he just happens to be a gay guy, right? And Christina Carl's sports work. And so they're not writing gay stories 99.9% of the time, but I love their lens on it, that I know that, if something interesting is going to pop out, I'm going to trust them as journalists.
So I have two questions left for you. So start thinking of your questions. Matthew, are people coming up to a microphone to ask the questions, or I'll repeat the questions for those who are watching remotely? With a microphone. Okay, so wait for Matthew to come to you with the microphone so people who are watching virtually can hear you. Two questions. First, what's good about how LGBTQ people are portrayed in the media? And then on an up note, then I'm going to ask you about what you're working on now. So, Tracy, what is good about the way in which we're portrayed?
Well, it is so much more diverse, complex, and nuanced than ever before, whether that's fiction or nonfiction, journalism, or other types of writing. So you have a better way to find who you might be and represent. But there is the diversity of our community the movement I think that we're most comparable is the disability rights movement, in that within the disability rights spectrum, there are 1,000 different ways to be. And that's true in the LGBTQ space. So there's no one representation that will do it. But, 30 years ago, you'd slap a young white gay guy on the cover of every single magazine. and even the mainstream was doing that too. They do a story on the queer community and it'd be this certain type of gay person. So I do think the diversity is better. I definitely think, I was speaking to a class of students the other day, and their question was about transmasculine representation. So while trans feminine folks are getting a drop of coverage still compared to everybody else, it's transmasculine that is really not covered that well. So the whole nuance of our rainbow is we basically are every letter of the alphabet and every color of the rainbow. We're in there somewhere, and that makes it really hard when you think about representation.
Kate, what's good? No, not Katie. Kate.
I know. Sorry, my mom calls me Kate sometimes, so I'm just like.
Sorry.
I think that what is good is that the media is becoming far more agile in terms of changing and insisting on better standards. I think that reporters recognize the intelligence of readers and the ability to consume complicated stories, to put in pronouns that are accurate, to name identities that maybe people haven't heard of, and to let that sit with readers and to let that sink in. And I think in the past we've been like, no, we really need to like dumb this down to a point that like is meaningless for the source. And I think we're getting to a place where we honor the identities of the people who are in our articles, and trust our readers to take that information in, and we're seeing that readers are able to consume that, and that they actually appreciate those complex stories.
I had dinner last night with a friend who's been my host in Chicago, who's going to be 80, and we had it was a language lesson, and it was almost like I'm not really the best person to lead that conversation because a lot of it's still newish to me. Although the word cisgender to me now, which I heard at a conference maybe 5 years ago in Canada the first time, I'm good at using that word. And my friend at dinner looked at me, she said, what is this cis thing? And then we got into pronouns, and we were, if we'd been drinking, we would have been on the floor laughing because she was just, and she's so curious, but just also had never heard most of it, because in the world she lives in, there's nobody from the spectrum, from our broad spectrum. She lives in a smallish world. So it was, there's a lot of educating yet to be done. Katie, what's good? And we know that your work is good and important.
That's nice. Thank you for saying that. I honestly don't actually think I really have anything to add.
Okay.
I think they summed it up really well.
So then I'll ask you the next question. You're working on a book.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Sure. The book, oh my gosh, that's my whole life right now. The book is about the ways in which ideas about sports and gender have made and remake each other, essentially. It's kind of about where we've been in terms of why we sex separate when it comes to sports, where we are now in terms of like the current moment where a lot of these really like essentialist ideas about gender are driving discourse around who should play sports and under what circumstances, and what that means, and then where we're going and where we could go.
And when will you be published?
Oh my God, when it's done.
When is it due?
Oh,
when is it due?
I am very deadline oriented, and I have blown through this one. So
when was it due?
oh God, like June,
And
then August.
And when do you think you'll have it?
Oh God, I really hope before the end of the year.
That's not that, in book publishing, that's not bad.
I know, my birthday is the day after Christmas, and I would really like the birthday gift to myself. Yes, I'm very Capricorn. Yes,
January.
love it. I'm a decidedly Slytherin Capricorn. It's very serious. So, are you laughing at me? That's fine. Yeah, so I would like that gift to be to myself and to finish it.
So probably published a year to 18 months after it's submitted.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, we'll look for it.
Yeah.
Kate, is there anything you're working on that you would like to tell us about?
I have a very significant long form, like 2-year investigation coming out in partnership with NBC on the 19th, with a good friend and colleague, Stephen Blum. So that should be coming out fairly soon. And then
Can you say what it's about, or
it's an investigation into a gay bar and its practices.
Oh my.
Yeah, so that's exciting. I love a good investigation. And I've also been, for the last 2.5 years, on and off, researching the murder of Rita Hester, whose death inspired Transgender Day of Remembrance and was never solved. And I will be revisiting that in the coming months.
Tracy Baim?
First, I'll be working on lobbying for Katie to have an ESPN show. That's my next project. But right now, the last 3 years being at the Chicago Reader, I haven't wanted to or needed to or had a minute to write as much as I used to. And I really pivoted in my mind to say, I've had a tremendous forum. Now my job is to save this forum for the next generation of journalists. And so that's kept me motivated, begging for dollars every day to keep the Reader alive and transitioning to a nonprofit. I do eventually want to write. I have 13 books, and all of them are about LGBT history in some way or another, all but one nonfiction. Eventually, I want to write a book about my mother as a journalist of a prior generation, but I'm going to make it probably a little bit fiction because she was an enigma and her own motivations. She died at 63, which I'm quite aware is only a handful of years away from where I'm at now, but was way ahead of her curve in terms of a woman journalist and what she had to do to just to write, to do her passion. And I want to, Karen's kind of given me this idea to maybe do it as kind of a chapter on her and a chapter on me, a chapter on her, a chapter on me. And in many ways, for the two grandchildren, she never got to meet my sister's kid and my brother's kid, who never met her. And they're in their 20s now, and I'd love to tell them stories about her. And she was such a role model to me in how to do it her own way.
And using fiction is a way of making it more accessible and also enriching it in a way you couldn't if it was strictly nonfiction. I say this because my partner's a literary agent. He works with a lot of reporters. And one in particular did a memoir of his mother that was reported. And it was, and I mean in the driest sense. And, and if this person had allowed themselves to imagine.
Yeah. And my cousin Sherry's here, and she met her, and some of my friends have met her, and she was just a spark of life. Her name was Joy, but she was tortured. She was tortured having grown up by an evil stepmother, her dad. I mean, it was a horrible life that she made and carved into her own, and in many ways inspired me to do that myself. So, yeah, no, fiction could allow me to have her have a voice.
Yes.
To quote her.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So we'll see.
I look forward to seeing that. Ready for your questions? If you raise your hand if you have a question.
Oh my God.
One over here. Actually, we'll start there.
I can't even finish one.
You are finishing it.
Well, yeah, because I have to. I know, it's like I need a bathroom. That's why I have to finish this book.
I have a question. I think it's for Katie, but it might be for
yikes.
everyone. And I work in communications, and I tell stories at an economic justice nonprofit that's hoping to change policy. And I love that your propensity is picking specific people about whom you're going to tell stories. And when I have a story to tell someone, I need tips for how to safeguard that that person so that they're not exploited. And it probably applies to all of you. In the industry, are there ways that you have been able to safeguard people's stories? Because thus far, the only way I can try to do that is go through journalists that I trust.
Oh, well, yeah, always go through journalists you trust. I think one way that I do that as a journalist is I am very transparent with what I'm asking of a subject. So, for example, I do a lot of long form, and that requires a certain level of openness for it to be successful. Like in some ways, like I need a person to tell me their story to get all those juicy details that are the things that people talk about. And I did a cover story on Nlgja Clarendon, who plays for the Minnesota Lynx now, and when we had a conversation about like, okay, do you want this to be a cover story? They want it as a cover. This is what that means. And so I was very clear about what exactly it was going to entail from them in order for this to be successful. It was like, we're going to do this 3-hour photo shoot. We're going to do this video interview. It's going to be on camera. Yes, we will style you, but like it's on camera. I'm going to call you a lot. I'm going to be very in your life. And I say all of that, and that I think sometimes when we are talking, I think within our community, saying, well, it's important for you to share your story. We don't always communicate exactly what that means. And there's a way to tell stories about individual people as it explores a policy moment in particular that is ethical. But I think also we have to prepare folks for what putting themselves out there is going to look like. And as somebody who's an intermediary, I think that's also really important. And so, yeah, talk to journalists that you trust, but then I think also, we as a community need to be better, I think, about communicating exactly what it means when we say, oh yeah, you should tell your story to this journalist. Because as soon as you begin that process, you lose control over that story, no matter how ethical a journalist may or may not be.
It's important to prep the person in advance and let them know that they can say, what I'm about to tell you is off the record, or everything is off the record except what I tell you you can put on the record, and to be clear about it. But it's even, it makes me very nervous being interviewed because I don't have control over it, and I'm used to having control over everything that I do. And you have to trust that they're going to do the best they can, and invariably people make mistakes. There was one time when it was for Time Magazine, and I was so excited being interviewed by Time Magazine. It was 1992. And the guy who did it was writing about my history book. And he said, my quote was, that I said was, before AIDS, there was already a well-developed gay community. And he quoted me saying, before AIDS, there was no such thing as a gay community. And it was an honest mistake, and it got me in a lot of trouble. So there's always some risk in telling your story. That's just one small example. And he called me to say how excited he was that he got the article in the magazine. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that he misquoted me. So another question. There's a question over here. The co-publisher of Chicago Reader? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not a plant, I swear. And I also just want to make clear that I'm trying to get Tracy to write a memoir just about herself, but we compromised on this intermingling chapter. So y'all all mentioned queer publications, them, Windy City Times, Into. Why are those publications still important at a time when mainstream publications, and we all work for mainstream publications, are not queer publications now? Why is it still important that these outlets exist?
That's a great question that I meant to ask but forgot to put on the list. Thank you for asking it. So, well, do we need these publications anymore? And why does something like Windy City Times survive when so many of the publications have died?
Well, it folded its print edition last year, but it's partnering with the Reader on 4 quarterly issues now. To me, the nuance and depth of coverage is across the board different for any community press. So if you have an African American paper, a Polish Daily News, Korean Times, those all have so much more depth to their community. So you need the Tribune and the New York Times and all those folks to cover queer stuff. And they have queer reporters too. But the LGBTQ press still has a role. Next week, or in a couple weeks, look for an announcement of 6 of us joining, 6 outlets joining together to try to do something nationally to bring more resources into LGBTQ media. Windy City Times being one of those 6 through a grant. But right now, interestingly, next week, Windy City Times has a Field Foundation grant and has 4 fellows being paid $1,000 a month for 3 months to do in-depth coverage of LGBTQ issues. And Adam and Karen are among people next Saturday that are going to do a 2-hour training for other journalists, that most of them in college right now, on how to cover LGBTQ issues. So what happens is the independent press is often the training ground for LGBT reporters too, to then go into the mainstream and have a more detailed. So it's a little bit of both. It's like a training ground and also a place where, I'll just give you an example, obituaries. I mean, obituaries are the honor of a journalist to do. I've done thousands of them for my community. And I write, 1,000 words on somebody that may be lucky to get a sentence in the mainstream. So yes, the big people are known and they get obits, but a lot of the people I know who have done the work that didn't get recognized in the mainstream, the LGBTQ press are the only ones that are going to acknowledge their work in any kind of depth. So I think it's still needed, and figuring out a way to survive is now the key.
I think, even just thinking about my own work in this moment, like just in regards to just the horrific time that was the 2021 legislative session, like I think that alone proves why we need LGBTQ media. Because the mainstream media, like, sure, there are so many journalists that we can name who are individuals who are contributing, myself included, but like, as I've said, we're individual people. The power structures still remain the same. And as long as that is the case, there will always be a need for community presses, and especially ours.
Sorry.
There's a few things to point out too. The New York Times still doesn't have an LGBTQ beat reporter, and it hasn't. They don't have a full-time person covering LGBTQ issues. and most major newspapers don't. There are very few transgender people working full-time at major news outlets. Chris Geidner, who's a well-known LGBTQ reporter, asked on Twitter a few months ago, like, who are the trans reporters reporting on LGBTQ issues? And we were all like full-time at a major media, and we were like,
I don't even get brought up because people
like,
forget about sports.
and then we were like, and we were, so like, it's as much as these stories exist and we are in media covering stories and doing these stories as one-offs, like doing this work full-time all the time, like that doesn't exist. These stories like don't exist. And keeping our organizations honest and keeping that work honest, like that is a real labor. It has to be done. I checked my phone as you asked that question, and I have 86 emails since we've been sitting here, and I'm sure almost all of them are pitches. Like I cannot keep up with the pace of work that like our stories.
How many emails?
86. I'm sure a lot of them are from the White House. Like just, but like there are so many. No, it's just like it's like it's just like press release, press
I
release,
know
press
what you
release.
meant, but somebody had to
Oh
flip
my
a
God.
hair.
But you know what I mean? Like
What
it's
are we
like,
doing?
but there's so many
Yeah.
more pitches than you can cover, right? Like there's
Mhm.
and every story I'm like, it's heartbreaking not to, right? There's so much more news than we can cover, and like you could put 5 LGBTQ reporters at every major news outlet, and you wouldn't scratch the surface.
Yeah, and I think and I specialize in long form.
Yeah.
So there are these moments where like my sources, and I know what they want, and I'm like,
Okay.
well, it's like I can do a newser for you. Like I did a news article today. But if it's not going to make the headline stack on ESPN, no one's going to read it. And so, for me, I'm like, okay, what is the goal of what I'm trying to do? And I'm always weighing those things in terms of needing to invest in everyday coverage as much as I can to find the stories that then I can make into a bigger deal that then land on the front page, that garner the readership and have the impact that I want them to have. But like Kate said, like, we're single people. Like there's so much more that needs to be done. And also, frankly, sometimes I don't want to. Like sometimes I am focused on something else, and maybe it's just like a she's good at basketball story, but I just need to do a she's good at basketball story to like recover and go back into like covering the hellscape that is right now. And that, that's something that is, I think, really a challenge. And I think for mainstream media, a lot of times, it's like they'll tell their political reporter to come and pitch, pitch a story, pinch it on a story about, the LGBT sports bills that are being considered. And I'm like, well, I mean, sure, but like also it kind of need to be a science reporter and a sports reporter. Like you can't just show up just as a politics reporter. And like that lack of nuance, it continues, I think, to plague coverage of our communities in different ways. Of course, I happen to be hypersensitive around sports, but I'm sure there are so many other examples of that.
So we're at the top of the hour, as we say in television news, and I want to thank the three of you for your extraordinary work and for being here tonight. And thank you to all of you. And
Thank you.
I'm going to turn this back over to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to, again, thank the panel. This was amazing. When I started this job 14 years ago, I was very impressed that the museum gave me a forum to work with my colleagues to eventually have programming like this. For the first time ever, the museum was going to march in the Pride Parade. And then that thing, COVID, took that off the table for us. We're very proud of the fact that we've been able to have these sorts of programs. Be watching for our next virtual program that's going to be on December 16th. It is about LGBTQ plus issues in immigration and refugees. And you will all be receiving an email with a survey to tell us how fantastic we were. Thank you so much, and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.